A billionaire shows up at a stranger's ranch with one question: marry me. You have 24 hours to decide. She doesn't love him. She barely knows his name. But without a husband by Valentine's Day, she loses everything her family built and hands it over to the one man who would burn it to the ground. He's a single father with mud on his boots and no reason to say yes. He says yes anyway. What happens next will cost them both more than either of them expected. If this story finds you tonight, hit like, drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this goes. The dog heard her first. Diesel, Ryan Carter's 3-year-old Australian shepherd, lifted his head from the porch boards around 6:15 in the evening, ears rotating like satellite dishes catching a distant signal. Ryan was crouched near the water trough at the far end of the paddock, tightening a bolt that had been working itself loose for the better part of a week, when Diesel stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, and let out a single low bark. Not alarm exactly, more like announcement. Ryan straightened, wiped the back of his wrist across his forehead, and turned toward the dirt road. There was a car out there. Not a truck, not a farm vehicle, not even the kind of used SUV that the county agricultural extension officer drove when he came out twice a year. This was a black car the size of a small living room, and it was moving down his road the way expensive things move, slowly, deliberately, certain that whatever lay at the end was worth arriving at. Ryan set down the wrench. The car stopped about 30 feet short of his gate. Nobody got out for a moment. He watched it. Diesel trotted to the bottom of the porch steps and stood there with his nose high. Then the rear door opened and a woman stepped out. She was dressed like she'd come from a meeting in a building that had marble floors and security desks in the lobby. Dark blazer, dark slacks, shoes that had no business being on a gravel road. She was somewhere around 30, he guessed. Maybe a little younger, maybe exactly that, with dark hair pulled back tightly enough that it probably hurt by the end of the day. She looked at the gate. She looked at the sign that said Carter Ranch, private property. She looked at the house. Then she looked at him. Ryan walked toward the gate at a pace that wasn't hurrying. You lost. No, she said. I'm looking for Ryan Carter. You found him. She didn't smile, didn't relax, didn't do any of the things people usually did when they found what they were looking for. She just studied him for another second with eyes that were clearly accustomed to rapid assessment, and then she said, I need to speak with you privately. It's important. Uh-huh. Ryan unlatched the gate, pulled it open, and looked past her at the car. The driver was still behind the wheel. There might have been someone else in the back, hard to tell through the tinted glass. You want to come up to the porch, or you want to tell me what this is about first? I'd prefer inside. I don't know you. Victoria Langford. She said it without hesitation, like she expected the name to land. When nothing changed in his face, something shifted in hers. Barely, just a flicker, but it was there. Of Langford Capital. Ryan had heard of Langford Capital in the same way he'd heard of a lot of things that existed in a different atmosphere from his own. Through news, radio, and the kind of magazine that got left in a dentist's waiting room. Investment firm, enormous, family-owned, or something like that. Okay, he said, you haven't heard of me. I've heard of the company. But not me. Should I have? She looked at him for a moment, and for the first time he caught something that might have been genuine human reaction underneath the controlled surface. She let a short breath out through her nose. No, she said. I suppose not. He opened the gate wider. Porch is fine. I'll get coffee. Ryan's son, Noah, was 7 years old and had his father's habit of going quiet when something interesting was happening. When Ryan came back to the porch with 2 mugs, he found Victoria Langford standing with her arms crossed and Noah sitting on the top porch step approximately 3 feet away, staring up at her with the particular unblinking frankness that children had before they learned it was considered rude. He yours? Victoria asked, accepting the mug. Yeah. Ryan set a hand briefly on the top of Noah's head. Noah, go inside and finish your homework. I'm watching, Noah said. I know what you're doing. Go. Noah went, but slowly, turning to look back twice. Victoria watched him go without expression. Ryan sat down in one of the porch chairs and waited. He'd learned a long time ago that the person who talked first in a silence usually wanted something. He was fairly sure he wasn't the one who wanted something here. Victoria remained standing. She was holding the mug in both hands but not drinking from it. After a moment, she said, "How much do you know about trust administration?" "Almost nothing. My grandfather founded Langford Capital in 1971. When he died, he left controlling shares of the company in a family trust. The terms of that trust include a clause, a provision that was probably meant as a joke or a social pressure tactic, or both, that requires any direct heir who holds the executive chair to be legally married before the age of 32. Ryan said nothing. "I am 30 years old," Victoria continued. "I have held the executive chair since my father stepped down 3 years ago. The deadline imposed by the trust is February 14th. She looked at him. "That is 11 days from now. Valentine's Day." "Yes. If I am not legally married by midnight on Valentine's Day, voting control of the company transfers to the next family shareholder with a qualifying claim." She paused. "My cousin, Trevor Langford. And that's bad. Trevor has been positioning himself for this for 2 years. He has a coalition of institutional investors who share his philosophy. His philosophy is to break the company into components and sell them, which would destroy approximately 4,000 jobs, eliminate our charitable foundation, and undo 30 years of work." Her voice stayed level throughout this. She wasn't performing distress. That was what got Ryan's attention. Not that she was upset, but that she was containing it so thoroughly it was visible in the muscles of her jaw. "So yes, that is bad." Ryan drank some coffee. "What does this have to do with me?" Victoria set the mug down on the porch railing. She turned and looked at him directly. "I need to be married before February 14th. I don't have time to explain the full scope of why, but every person I know in my professional circle either has a conflict of interest, a financial stake in the outcome, or is someone Trevor's team would use against me. I need someone outside my world, someone who can't be traced to a pre-existing agreement." She held his gaze. "Someone who has no obvious reason." Ryan stared at her. "You're serious?" "Completely. You drove out here, a woman who runs a billion-dollar company, and you're asking a rancher you've never met to marry you." "Yes." He put the mug down on the arm of the chair and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The evening was cooling off, and somewhere down the fence line, one of the horses was moving, and the ordinary sounds of his life continued around this absolutely extraordinary conversation. "How'd you find me?" "Research. You have no financial exposure to any sector my company operates in. You're not affiliated with any investor group. You have a clean record. You own this property outright. You have no social media presence that Trevor's team could mine for connections." She delivered this like a resume summary. "And 3 years ago, you wrote a letter to the county zoning board opposing a development proposal that would have benefited a Langford-affiliated real estate fund. You didn't know that. You just didn't want the development in your county." "I didn't want the water table messed with." "I know." Something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a less guarded expression, but she reined it in. "You're not someone who can be easily bought or threatened. That matters more to me right now than almost anything else." Ryan sat back. He looked out at the darkening pasture. A single light was on in the barn, left on by habit, and the last orange edge of the sun was dissolving behind the line of cedar trees to the west. He was quiet for long enough that Victoria shifted her weight, the first physical sign of impatience she'd shown. "What are you offering?" he asked. "Financial compensation, obviously. A generous amount, an airtight prenuptial agreement that protects both of us completely, a private legal contract specifying the terms, duration, expectations, exit clause. After the company situation is resolved, which I expect to take no more than 6 to 8 months, we file for divorce quietly. The entire thing stays confidential." She had clearly prepared this. "I don't want anything from you except your legal name and your presence at events where it's necessary for the marriage to appear credible." "That's it." "That's it." Ryan looked at her, really looked, not the polite survey he'd given her when she got out of the car. She was standing in front of him with her shoulders square and her chin level and her hands clasped in front of her with a control that had probably been practiced over many years. But the control wasn't the whole picture. Around the eyes, there was something that looked less like a corporate executive presenting a proposal and more like a person who had been awake for too many consecutive nights, running through too many consecutive worst-case scenarios. "You're scared," he said. Her jaw tightened. "I'm concerned about the outcome." "That's the same thing." "It isn't." "What happens to your employees if Trevor takes over?" The question caught her slightly sideways. He could see it. She'd come prepared for negotiation, for skepticism, for demands about money. She'd not come prepared for him to ask about other people first. 4,200 and some direct employees, she said after a pause. Probably another 12,000 in contractor relationships. Most of them would survive in some form. Some of them wouldn't. She hesitated. The Women's Economic Development Fund we run would be closed. It served about 60,000 women in developing markets over 8 years. Trevor considers it a liability. Ryan nodded slowly. He thought about Noah, inside doing homework, who still talked about his mother sometimes in that careful way kids had when they'd learned which topics made the adults in the room go sad. He thought about what it felt like to be responsible for something you couldn't afford to lose. He didn't like this. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, even in the privacy of his own skull. He didn't like it. It was strange, and it was the kind of thing that had the potential to become very complicated. It was also, on its face, an unusual amount of trust extended to a stranger, because no matter how thoroughly she'd researched him, she was still standing on a porch, asking a man she'd never met before to attach his legal identity to hers. "I have a son," he said. "I know. He's 7. His routine is important. His stability is important. If something about this arrangement disrupts that, the arrangement ends, and no amount of money changes that." "Understood." "I'm not interested in your money." That stopped her. A different kind of look went through her eyes. "Then what are you interested in?" "I'm not sure yet." He stood up. He was about 4 inches taller than her, which put them at a proximity that was unusual for a conversation with a stranger, but neither of them moved back. "I'll give you an answer tomorrow. 8 in the morning. You can come back or you can leave me a number." She studied him for a beat. "Tomorrow may not be enough time to—" "I know your deadline. I'm not wasting your days. I'm taking one night to think. That should tell you something about how I make decisions." The trace of something, not quite a smile but adjacent to one, moved through her expression and was gone. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and handed him a card. Plain white, name and number, no title. 8 o'clock, she said. 8 o'clock. She picked up the untouched mug, looked at it for a moment, and drank from it. Then she set it back on the railing and walked back to the car. Diesel watched her go. Ryan watched him watch her. He didn't sleep much. He did the things he always did in the evening, helped Noah finish the last of a math worksheet that neither of them was particularly enthusiastic about, made grilled cheese and tomato soup for dinner because it was a Tuesday, and that's what Tuesdays had become. Listened to Noah describe a disagreement with a classmate named Marcus in The Patient, slightly exhausting detail that 7-year-olds brought to social conflict. He read Noah a chapter and a half of the book they were working through, turned off the light, sat for a minute on the edge of the bed after Noah's breathing evened out. Then he went back to the kitchen and sat at the table with a pad of paper and wrote down, in plain language, every possible problem he could think of. The media. He had no experience with media, and Victoria Langford was the kind of person who generated media attention. That was a problem. His son. Any disruption to Noah's world was a non-starter. The question was whether the marriage would be visible enough in their day-to-day life to constitute a disruption. His reputation in the county. He'd built relationships here over 12 years, with neighbors, with the agricultural co-op, with the school Noah attended. Walking into a courthouse with a billionaire he'd met the previous evening was the kind of thing that generated talk. Trevor Langford. If Trevor was willing to go after Victoria with this much aggression, he would go after a new husband with equal aggression. That was obvious. He wrote all of it down. Then, on a separate section of the paper, he wrote one line. She asked for help, and she's the only person in this equation who didn't have to. He stared at that for a while. He thought about the women's fund she'd mentioned, the 60,000 women across 8 years. She hadn't led with that. She delivered it only when he'd asked directly, and she'd delivered it without embellishment, as a fact. If she'd been performing generosity, she'd have opened with it. She hadn't. He also thought about the look in her eyes when he'd said she was scared, that involuntary tightening, that precision of denial. I'm concerned about the outcome. He'd known people who used language that controlled instead of revealed, and he'd known the particular effort it took. Whatever she felt about her situation, she was carrying it alone, and she'd been carrying it alone for long enough that she'd forgotten what it felt like not to. He didn't know this woman. He'd spent 45 minutes with her. At 11:15, he folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket and went to bed. She arrived at 8:03. Ryan was sitting on the porch with coffee when she came through the gate. She'd come alone this time, no driver visible, though there was still a car parked at the road. She was dressed differently, less boardroom, dark jeans, a gray jacket that was clearly expensive but significantly less formal. She'd traded the knife-point shoes for something with a lower heel. Her hair was still pulled back, but more loosely. He noticed she looked like she'd slept about as well as he had. "Coffee?" he asked. "Please." He went in and got a second mug. When he came back out, she was standing at the porch railing looking out across the pasture. 3 horses were visible in the morning light: Cassius, an older bay gelding, and 2 younger mares he'd bought 2 years back. The air smelled like damp earth and grass and the cold that hadn't yet burned off. "It's quiet," she said. "Yes." She accepted the mug, wrapped both hands around it the same way she had the night before, and didn't drink. She turned to face him. "Before you give me your answer, I want to add something I didn't say last night." "All right." "I didn't choose you because you're anonymous," she said. "That's part of it, but it's not all of it. I chose you because the letter you wrote to the county zoning board was honest. You weren't grandstanding. You weren't trying to stop progress. You were trying to protect something you'd worked for and that you believed other people needed." She paused. "I needed someone who understood what it means to protect something worth protecting, not just someone who couldn't be bought." Ryan looked at her for a moment. "That's a better reason," he said. "I know. I should have led with it last night." "Why didn't you?" She looked down at the mug. The corner of her mouth moved. "Because it's harder to say." "Okay." He sat down. "I'll do it." She went still. "There are conditions," he said. "You probably expected conditions." She breathed out slowly. "Yes." "Noah comes first. If at any point this situation is affecting him negatively, his routine, his school, his sense of safety, you and I have an immediate conversation, and we adjust, whatever that means. Agreed?" "Agreed." "I don't move to a city. My life is here. If events require my presence elsewhere, I travel, I return. This is Noah's home, and it doesn't change." "Agreed." "I won't lie about things that don't need to be lied about. The arrangement, sure, we keep that private because we have to, but I won't make up a story about how we met that's more complicated than necessary. We met through a mutual contact, we got to know each other, we decided to get married. Simple. That's fine. Simple is better. And I'm not taking money." He held up a hand before she could say anything. "I'm not. If there are costs associated with my participation, travel, clothing, whatever, those are covered. But I'm not receiving a check for doing this, and I'm not signing anything that looks like a payment arrangement, because if that document ever surfaces, Trevor will use it as a weapon." She was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this carefully." "I think about everything carefully. It's boring, but it helps." "The prenuptial agreement still stands. It protects you." "That I'll sign. It protects you too." She nodded. She looked out at the pasture again, and in the morning light, with the coffee mug in both hands and the slightly loosened hair, she looked less like the controlled executive she'd been the previous evening, and more like a person who had just put down something she'd been carrying at arm's length for a long time, and was figuring out whether her hands still worked. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why?" "Not the practical reasoning. I understand that. But you don't know me. I showed up yesterday and asked you to do something that will affect your life in ways I can't fully predict, and you said yes. So why?" Ryan thought about it honestly, the way he thought about most things. "Because you could have offered me 10 times the money and twice the legal protection, and it wouldn't have changed my answer either way," he said. But the thing you said about the Women's Fund, the 60,000 women across 8 years, you said it, and then you stopped. Like you didn't want me to think you were using it to persuade me. He looked at her. That's not how someone who's using that information as a tool says it. That's how someone who actually gives a damn says it. Victoria Langford looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly, not surprise exactly. Something that sat between the two and had a third quality mixed in, something rawer. Then she looked away, out toward the horses. All right, she said. So, we need to be at the county clerk's office before 11 to apply for the license. There's a 3-day waiting period in Texas, which means the earliest we can legally marry is Friday. Friday. That gives us just over a week before Valentine's Day, which is the outer edge of what I need. She shifted into something more businesslike, not because the moment before had been wrong, but because moving forward was how she processed things. He was already starting to understand that. My attorney will contact your attorney today to begin the prenuptial paperwork. I don't have an attorney. She looked at him. I'll get one, he said. I'll recommend someone not connected to your company. A pause. Of course. I'll handle it. He stood. I need to get Noah ready for school. You can wait here, or you can come back at 10:15. She considered. I'll come back. Okay. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Victoria. She turned. This is going to be harder than you've planned for, he said. It wasn't a warning exactly, more like something he felt she needed to hear from someone who wouldn't soften it. Arrangements like this have a way of becoming more complicated than the contract says they should be. I don't mean emotionally, I just mean logistically. In people's heads and how they see you, you probably know that already. I do, she said. I just want to make sure you're not looking at this like a transaction that stays clean. Nothing involving my company ever stays clean. There was a dryness in it that sounded like the first genuine thing she'd said to him in 2 days. That's something I accepted a long time ago. He nodded and went inside. The county clerk's office in Harlan County was a single-story building with beige walls and fluorescent lighting, and a woman behind the counter named Donna, who had been processing forms there for going on 22 years, and who did not change her expression when Ryan Carter and a woman she didn't recognize came in and asked for a marriage license application. What Donna did do after she'd taken their IDs and begun entering information was look up over her reading glasses at Victoria and say slowly, "You're not from here." "No," Victoria said. "Austin?" "New York, primarily." Donna looked at Ryan. Ryan looked back at her with the particular neutral expression he used for situations that were going to be talked about later regardless of what he did. Donna returned to the form. The photographer caught them on the way out. Ryan didn't see him until he heard the shutter, a rapid sequence from across the parking lot where a man with a telephoto lens was sitting in a beige sedan trying to look inconspicuous and failing. He caught Ryan's eye, and the shutter went again, faster. Victoria didn't react. She walked to the car at the same pace, got in, and said, "Trevor's people are fast." That was Trevor's guy? Probably. He has a media monitoring service. They would have flagged my location when I entered the county. She was already on her phone. It doesn't matter. This was expected. Ryan looked at the sedan as they drove past. The photographer was already on his own phone. "It's going to be in the news." "Yes." "Before we've had a chance to explain anything." "Yes." She glanced up from her screen. "I'm sorry. I knew this would happen. I should have been clear about the timeline." "You were pretty clear." "I should have been clearer anyway." He appreciated that. Not the apology itself. He'd had people apologize to him his entire life for things they'd planned to do. But the directness of it, the absence of elaborate justification. They drove back to the ranch in a silence that was different from the previous day's silence. That one had been assessment. This one was the particular quiet of people who have made a decision together and are now in the middle of it and are still figuring out what it actually costs. The story broke the next morning. Texas rancher mystery. Husband. Who is Victoria Langford's last-minute groom? Billionaire heiress files marriage license with unknown man as deadline. Loom sources. Say Langford marriage was arranged to secure trust. Clause. Is this legal? Ryan read 3 of them at his kitchen table at 6 in the morning. Noah still asleep, coffee going cold. The photos were clear. The parking lot, the 2 of them walking out of the county clerk's office, his face recognizable. His name, his ranch, a cursory description of his background. Ryan Carter, 32, single father, small-scale rancher in Harlan County, Texas. No known prior connection to the Langford family. His phone had 12 messages from numbers he didn't recognize. 3 from neighbors. 1 from his ex-wife's cousin for reasons he couldn't immediately fathom. 2 from news organizations requesting comment. He deleted the news ones. He texted back 2 of the neighbors with some variation of, "I'll explain when I can, nothing to worry about." He stared at the ex-wife's cousin's message for a moment and decided to deal with that later. He was on the porch when Victoria's car came down the road at 7:15. He'd asked her to come early. She got out looking exactly as if she'd been up since the stories broke, which she probably had, and she looked at him with an expression that was checking for the extent of damage. "How mad are you?" she asked. "Not mad." He said it and found it was true. "Unhappy about the timing. Not mad." That's a meaningful distinction. "I have a son. He's going to hear things at school. I need to get ahead of that before he leaves the house." Something crossed her face that he was starting to identify as the expression she made when she'd processed a consequence she'd abstractly acknowledged, but hadn't fully imagined in physical terms. "What do you need?" "I need to sit down with him this morning and explain some version of this before he walks into whatever his classmates have already been talking about. And I need your help because you know what's coming better than I do." She was quiet for a second. "You want me to be here for that?" "Only if you're willing." She looked at the house. He could see her calculating, not in a cold way, but in the way that was natural to someone who'd spent years translating every situation into logistics, what it would require, what it would mean. She nodded. They went inside. Noah was already up, sitting at the kitchen table in pajamas and dinosaur socks, eating cereal and working on a drawing that appeared to be a horse fighting some kind of monster. He looked up when Victoria walked in behind his father, and his expression shifted through recognition. He remembered her from the porch 2 days ago, and then to curiosity. "You came back," he said. "I did," Victoria said. She looked at the drawing. "That's a big horse." "He's fighting a Komodo dragon." Noah looked up at her with the frank assessment of a 7-year-old. "You're really dressed up for morning." "I was raised that way." It stuck. Noah considered this explanation and apparently found it acceptable, returning briefly to his drawing before looking back up at his father. Something in Ryan's posture had clearly communicated serious conversation, because Noah put his crayon down and straightened up with the particular gravity of a kid who'd learned that when adults arranged their faces a certain way, the information that followed required attention. "Hey," Ryan said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "So I need to tell you something, and I want you to listen all the way through before you ask questions, okay?" Noah nodded. Ryan explained it in the only way that worked with his son, which was plainly without excessive softening. Victoria was his friend. They'd met a few weeks ago, he amended, because the alternative was a more complicated truth than a 7-year-old needed. She was facing a difficult situation with her family business, and she needed some help, and part of helping her meant getting married, which they were going to do on Friday. It would probably be in the news, which meant people at school might talk about it. Noah processed this in silence, which was his method. Then, "Married like married?" "Yes." "Like a real wedding?" "Just at the courthouse. No party." "Why?" "Because we're in a hurry." Noah looked at Victoria with an expression that was both deeply skeptical and openly curious. "Do you like our ranch?" Victoria looked slightly caught off guard by the specific nature of the question. "I think so. I haven't seen much of it yet." "Do you like horses?" "I've never spent much time with them." "Dad could show you. He's good at showing people horses." Noah looked back at Ryan. "Is she going to live here?" "Sometimes. She has a house in New York." "That's far." "Yes." Noah picked his crayon back up. He drew one more line on the Komodo dragon. "Okay," he said. Ryan looked at him. "That's it? Just okay?" "You said to listen all the way through." He looked up. "I listened. It seems okay," She seems okay. A brief glance at Victoria. You can tell she hasn't been around horses before because she's wearing the wrong shoes. Victoria looked down at her shoes, and Ryan, who had not laughed out loud in front of a business contact in some time, found it unexpectedly difficult to keep his face from doing something. I'll get better shoes, Victoria told Noah seriously. We could probably find some in the barn. Dad keeps extras. That's very generous. They might be big. I'll manage. Noah returned to his drawing, satisfied, and Ryan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the particular feeling of a man who has made a complicated decision and is only now beginning to understand the full shape of what he's agreed to. The courthouse marriage was on a Friday morning at 9:30, presided over by a justice of the peace named Gerald Marsh, who had a gray mustache and the patient demeanor of a man who had married many people under many circumstances and had long ago stopped attaching personal narrative to any of them. There were 3 people present: Ryan, Victoria, and Elena Vasquez, Victoria's personal assistant, who served as witness and who kept her expression perfectly neutral throughout, with the practiced composure of someone who had witnessed her employer do many unconventional things and had learned to reserve judgment. They stood in front of Gerald Marsh in a beige room with a mounted state seal and an American flag that listed slightly to the left, and they said the words they were required to say, and Gerald Marsh pronounced them married at 9:41 in the morning, and Elena Vasquez handed Ryan the pen to sign the certificate, and he signed it, and Victoria signed it, and that was that. In the parking lot afterward, they stood for a moment without speaking. Elena had stepped aside to take a call, which left them briefly alone with the document that had just changed both their names in the official record. That was strange, Ryan said. Yes, Victoria said. You okay? She looked at him, surprised, he thought, by the question, like it wasn't one she'd expected. I'm fine, she said. You sure? She looked at the courthouse door and then back at him. She was holding a copy of the certificate in one hand and her phone in the other, and she looked just for a second like someone standing at the edge of something very large, trying to remember why they'd decided to jump. I'm sure, she said, but quietly. He nodded. We should get you to the airport. She had a board meeting in New York the following Monday that she couldn't postpone. Yes. She started toward the car and then stopped and turned back. Ryan. Yeah. Thank you. She said it like it cost something. Don't thank me yet, he said. We've got 10 days. She almost smiled. Yes, we do. He followed her to the car, and behind them the courthouse sat exactly as it always had in the February morning light, unchanged, indifferent to the particular thing that had just happened inside it. Diesel was asleep on the porch when Ryan got home, and the horses needed their afternoon feed, and Noah needed to be picked up from school in 2 hours, and the bolt on the water trough had probably worked itself loose again. He changed into work clothes and went out to check it. That was the phrase Elena used when she called Ryan on Saturday morning, 48 hours after the courthouse, while he was repairing a section of fence along the north pasture. He had the phone wedged between his ear and his shoulder, and a post driver in one hand, and he said, "What does that mean exactly?" And Elena said, in the composed, slightly apologetic tone of someone who delivered bad news for a living, "It means it's not going away. It means it's growing." By Saturday afternoon, 3 major financial news networks had run segments on the marriage. By Sunday, it had crossed over from financial media into general entertainment. Someone had found his high school rodeo records. Someone else had located a photograph from a county fair 3 years back, Ryan and Noah at a livestock competition. Noah holding a ribbon for a calf he'd helped raise. Ryan with his hand on his son's shoulder, looking like, and this was the actual caption on one website, exactly the kind of salt-of-the-earth authenticity a billionaire heiress would manufacture for a PR stunt. He read that one twice. He put his phone face down on the kitchen counter and finished making dinner. Noah had heard things at school, but less than Ryan had feared. The second grade operated on a different news cycle from financial media, and what Noah's classmates knew was mostly that his dad had gotten married to a rich lady from New York, which led primarily to questions about whether they were getting a bigger TV and whether Victoria had ever met anyone famous. Noah had reported these conversations to Ryan with the detached anthropological interest he brought to most social dynamics, and Ryan had answered them as flatly as possible, and that had been more or less the extent of it. The harder conversation had been with his neighbor Dale Pritchard, who farmed the adjacent property and was also one of the few people Ryan considered a genuine friend. Dale had come by Sunday afternoon under the pretense of returning a borrowed trailer jack, which was Dale's method of checking on a person without appearing to check on them, and they'd sat on the porch for an hour while Dale asked careful questions with the patience of a man who understood that the full story usually emerged on its own schedule. Ryan told him most of it, not the specific legal mechanics, but the shape of it, that Victoria had come to him with a real problem, that he'd made a decision with his eyes open, that it was complicated but not dishonest. Dale had been quiet for a long moment. Then, "You know what people are going to say." "Yes." "And that's okay with you?" "It doesn't matter much what I can't control." Dale had looked at him with the expression of a man who had known Ryan for 12 years and had watched him make decisions that were sometimes inexplicable and were generally fine in the end. She seemed like a decent person. Ryan thought about the way Victoria had talked to Noah about the wrong shoes, the way she'd said thank you in the parking lot like it cost her something. "Yeah, she seems like a decent person going through a rough stretch." Dale nodded and handed back the trailer jack and went home, which Ryan understood as acceptance. Victoria called that evening from New York at 9:15, which was 10:15 her time. He was on the porch. The night was cold and clear, and the stars over the pasture were the kind that people from cities drove out to see on weekends. "How bad is it in your world?" she asked. "Manageable." "How bad is it in yours?" 3 board members called me separately today to express concern. 2 of them used the word impulsive. One of them said optics. Her voice was dry. "I've been managing those 3 men for 2 years and none of them has ever used the word optics to my face before." "What did you tell them?" "That I appreciated their concern and would be happy to discuss it further when the trust clause was satisfied and the company's governance was no longer under legal threat, professionally." A brief pause. "Which is not what I wanted to say." "What did you want to say?" "Something with significantly more profanity." He heard something shift. She'd moved, sat down maybe. "How's Noah?" The question still caught him slightly off guard when she asked it. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it was specific, not the generic "how is everything" that people used when they meant nothing in particular. She asked about Noah directly. "He's good. He's been asking questions about New York, whether the buildings are actually that tall or whether it's a camera trick." "They're actually that tall." "I told him that. He's skeptical. There's a view from the office building. You can see the whole harbor on a clear day. He'd find it convincing." Ryan looked out at the dark pasture. "Maybe someday." She was quiet for a moment. "Ryan, there's going to be a charity event next Saturday, the Whitmore Foundation Gala. I've attended every year for the past 6. I was planning to skip it this year given everything, but my PR team is arguing that going together would be useful. Show the marriage in a social context." A gala. I know that word probably doesn't sound appealing. It sounds like a lot of people in a room. That's an accurate description. She paused again. "I'm not asking you to perform. I'm asking you to be there. Those are different things." He thought about it. He thought about the bolt on the water trough, which he'd now fixed twice, and the section of north fence, and the farrier coming on Thursday, and Dale's offer to check in on things if Ryan needed to travel. He thought about the fact that he'd agreed to this, and that agreeing to it had included agreeing to the parts that weren't comfortable. "All right," he said. "You'll need a suit." "I have a suit." A beat. "When did you last wear it?" "My cousin's wedding, 4 years ago." "It might need—" "I know what it might need. I'll handle it." He heard what might have been a brief, quietly suppressed sound. Not quite a laugh, but something in that neighborhood. "All right," she said. "I'll have Elena send you the details." He took the suit to a tailor in the county seat on Tuesday, a Vietnamese-American man named Huy, who had been operating in the same small shop for 16 years, and who looked at the suit with the expression of a professional confronting a genuine challenge and said, "Give me 2 days." And Ryan said, "Done," and that was that. Noah came with him to the tailor. He sat in the corner chair and drew in a notebook, and at one point said from behind the notebook, "Are you nervous about the party?" And Ryan said, "No." And Noah said, "You sound a little nervous." And Ryan said, "I'm not nervous, I'm thinking." And Noah said, "That's what nervous sounds like in dads." And Huey, who was on his knees marking the trousers, made a sound that he quickly disguised as a cough. The suit came back looking better than Ryan remembered it being. He hung it on the back of the guest room door and tried not to look at it too often. Elena texted him a list of names on Wednesday: board members, major donors, journalists likely to be in attendance, and one entry labeled simply Trevor Langford, possible attendance unconfirmed. Ryan read that last one twice and put his phone down and went out to the barn. He flew to New York on Friday afternoon. Dale came over to take Noah for the weekend, which Noah received as a gift since Dale's property included a creek and an old four-wheeler and a dog even larger than Diesel. Ryan packed a single bag, drove to the regional airport, and sat in a window seat watching Texas flatten out below the clouds, and thought about all the ways this could be worse than anticipated. The car Victoria sent met him at JFK, and the city was every cliché about cities at night. The density of lights, the noise that didn't seem like noise so much as a condition of the air itself, the sensation of enormous numbers of people living their lives within shouting distance of each other. He'd been to New York twice before, once on a school trip and once to visit an old friend who'd moved here for work, and both times he'd felt the same thing: a mild, persistent amazement that people built themselves routines inside something this large. The hotel was not his natural habitat. He checked in, found the room, sat on a bed that cost more per night than his monthly utility bills, and called Noah. "Is it tall?" Noah asked immediately. "Very tall." "Can you see the harbor?" "Not from this window. Different building." "Did you see Victoria yet?" "Tomorrow." "What are you doing tonight?" "Sitting on a bed that's too soft." Noah considered this. "That sounds bad." "It's fine. It's just different." He lay back on the overly soft mattress and looked at the ceiling. "How's Dale's dog?" "He ate a work glove." "He does that." "It was my glove." "I'll buy you new ones." "They were my good ones." "I know. I'll replace them." Ryan closed his eyes. "Get some sleep. I'll call tomorrow." "Is the party going to be okay?" "Yes." "You sure?" The same question he'd asked Victoria in the parking lot. He smiled at the ceiling. "Yes, buddy, I'm sure." Victoria's apartment was on the 34th floor of a building that probably had a name Ryan would recognize if he were more plugged into that world. She'd sent him an address for Saturday afternoon. Come at 4. The gala started at 7. And Elena had emailed what she diplomatically called a light briefing document, which turned out to be 11 pages covering likely attendees, probable conversation topics, questions to deflect, and a 2-paragraph section titled Suggested Natural-Sounding Narrative About How You Met. Ryan had read the first paragraph of that section, put the document down, and not picked it up again. When he knocked on the apartment door at 4:02, Victoria opened it herself, which surprised him slightly. He'd half expected Elena. She was in the middle of getting ready, wearing a robe and with her hair half done, and she looked at him for a moment with the specific disorientation of a person who had expected to have more time. "You're on time," she said, as if this were an unusual trait. "You said 4. "I know. Come in." She stepped back to let him in, and he crossed the threshold into a space that was... He searched for the right word and landed on particular. It was large by New York standards, he assumed, which meant it was a regular-sized room by most other standards, but every surface was occupied with something that looked like it had a history attached to it. Stacked documents on the dining table, an open laptop displaying a spreadsheet, a framed photograph on the wall of an older man who had Victoria's jawline and an expression of quiet determination. Bookshelves that were used, not decorative, books pulled out of order, some lying flat on top of others, a few with paper scraps as bookmarks. He'd expected something colder, more curated. "Sit anywhere," she said, moving back down the hallway. "I have about 20 minutes. There's coffee in the kitchen." He found the kitchen, found the coffee, poured himself a cup, and stood at the window looking out at the city. The harbor was visible from this angle, exactly as she'd described. A wide, gray-silver expanse in the late afternoon light, dotted with distant structures he couldn't name. "Did you read the briefing document?" she called from the other end of the apartment. Parts of it. A pause. Which parts? The guest list. Some of the section on board dynamics. He drank his coffee. Not the suggested narrative. Ryan, we met through a mutual contact. We spent some time together. We decided to get married quickly. That's the story. It's simple. It doesn't contradict anything, and neither of us has to remember a script. He set the mug down on the counter. That's what I said from the beginning. Another pause. Longer. That's fine, she said. You're right. She came back out 20 minutes later, and whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't entirely this. She was wearing dark green, a dress that was elegant without performing elegance, if that made any sense, and her hair was down, which he'd never seen before, and she looked less like the controlled woman who'd stood on his porch 11 days ago and more like someone he might actually know. She stopped when she caught his expression. What? Nothing. He amended it because it wasn't quite honest. You look different with your hair down. Is that a problem? No, just different. He finished the coffee. You ready? Almost. She crossed to the dining table and picked up a small jewelry case, opened it, and stood looking at it for a second. I have to ask you something, and I want you to not make it strange. Okay? She turned the case toward him. Inside was a ring. Simple, platinum, nothing ostentatious. I had this made last week. For tonight. It needs to look like a real marriage. She paused. Which means you'll need one too. She opened the other side of the case to reveal a matching band, plainer, clearly for a man. I should have discussed this earlier. I didn't think about it until Thursday, and then I didn't want to. She stopped. I'm sorry. I should have asked. Ryan looked at the ring. He looked at her. He thought about the specific thing she hadn't said, which was that this part of it, the ring, the symbol, the physical marker of the thing they'd done, was the part that didn't feel like a legal arrangement. It's fine, he said. You sure? You asked. That's what matters. He held out his hand. She put the ring on his finger, and her hands were steady because she was always steady in that particular way. But he felt the slight deliberateness of it, the way she was very careful to do it efficiently, and he understood that this part cost her something too, though he couldn't have said exactly what. He picked up the other ring and put it on her finger without ceremony, which was maybe the right approach, because she exhaled in a way that suggested she'd been holding something. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They went to the gala. Boss. The Whitmore Foundation event occupied the top floor of a building in Midtown that Ryan would later not be able to describe beyond glass, and a lot of it. There were perhaps 200 people in the room, the particular kind of 200 people who existed in a world stratified by net worth and institutional affiliation, and the noise level was the managed buzz of expensive social performance. He knew approximately 4 minutes into it that he was being looked at. Not rudely. Nobody in this room was ever rude in the obvious way, but assessed, the way you assessed a new variable introduced into a familiar equation. He'd grown up with people who hunted and farmed and fixed their own trucks, and he was familiar with being evaluated, just not by people in this particular tax bracket. Victoria stayed close. Not performing closeness, not doing the theatrical thing, but physically present in a way that he was beginning to understand was not natural to her. She was someone who moved through rooms independently. He could see that in how the room responded to her, in the way people stepped slightly aside and then came forward, the particular choreography of deference. Having him beside her was a different configuration than she was used to. She handled the early conversations well. Old donors, foundation board members, a senator who shook Ryan's hand and said, I hear you're a rancher. We need more of that kind of sense in this city, in the slightly too loud voice of someone performing casual friendliness. Ryan said, thank you, and meant nothing by it, and the senator moved on. Around 9 o'clock, he saw her face change. Not dramatically. A tightening that was barely visible, a slight recalibration of posture. He followed her sight line across the room to a man in his late 30s moving toward them, tall, dark-suited, with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to taking up space in rooms. Handsome in the way that required effort, hair that had been styled into an appearance of being unstyled. He was smiling, which was the most alarming thing about him. Victoria! The man opened his arms as if to embrace her, and she accepted it, briefly, with the body language of someone enduring a minor medical procedure. "You look wonderful. You've been avoiding my calls." "Hello, Trevor." Trevor Langford was easier to read in person than Ryan had expected. He was performing warmth with the precision of someone who'd practiced it extensively, and underneath it, visible only in the fraction of a second before each expression fully settled, was something considerably cooler. Trevor turned to Ryan, looked at him with an assessment that lasted one beat longer than was polite. "And you must be the husband." Ryan extended his hand. "Ryan Carter." Trevor Langford. He shook it with the particular grip of a man who believes something could be communicated through handshakes. "I've been looking forward to this. Victoria's told me almost nothing about you, which is actually quite interesting on its own." "We're private people," Ryan said. "Of course," Trevor smiled. "How are you finding New York?" "Big." "Ha!" The laugh was exactly calibrated. He turned back to Victoria. "I hope you know I have nothing but genuine wishes for your happiness. Whatever happens at the company level, you're still family." "I know what you are, Trevor," Victoria said pleasantly, the way she might say the weather's turned cold. Something flickered in Trevor's expression. He recovered quickly. "I'm going to find the bar. Ryan, really a pleasure." He walked away without hurrying. Ryan watched him go. "He's good at that," he said quietly. "Yes." Her voice was even. "He's been practicing since he was about 12. She took a glass of water from a passing server's tray and drank half of it. "Don't let him in your head. He's going to try." "I know." Ryan looked at the room. The conversation had been watched. He could see 3 or 4 people who'd been positioned close enough to overhear or who'd been facing the right direction. The information would move. "Are you all right?" She looked at him with the expression she made when she hadn't expected a direct question. "I'm fine." "You've said that a few times now when I think you mean something else." A pause. "I'm managing." "That's more accurate." She held his gaze for a moment, and something passed through her expression that was less defended than usual. Not an admission exactly, but an acknowledgement. "The event ends at 11, she said. "Then we can both go home and stop managing for the night." "Works for me." They stayed until 11:15 because a board member named Carolyn Marsh pulled Victoria into a conversation that Ryan correctly identified as important and chose not to interrupt. And so he spent 20 minutes talking to Carolyn's husband, a retired cardiologist who had strong opinions about Texas barbecue and the general decline of the American porch as an architectural feature, and Ryan found he had things to say about both. In the car back, Victoria sat in the far corner of the seat, and he sat in the near corner, and the city moved past the windows, and neither of them said anything for a while. She'd let her shoes off, which struck him as the first completely unguarded thing he'd seen her do all night. "Carolyn Marsh," she said eventually. "She's a swing vote on the board. She told me tonight she respects what I've built, but she thinks the trust clause situation undermines my judgment." "What did you say?" "That defending the company against an opportunistic family lawsuit while simultaneously running it was not evidence of poor judgment, it was evidence of demanding circumstances." She looked at the window. "She didn't fully agree, but she's still talking to me, which is something. She'll come around." "You sound sure of that." "She was watching you all night," he said. "People who've already made up their minds stop watching." Victoria turned from the window and looked at him. The city lights moved across her face, irregular intervals of orange and white. "How do you do that?" she said. "Do what?" "Read people that quickly." He shrugged. "I grew up with a father who didn't say much. You learn to watch." She was quiet for a moment. "My father said everything, constantly. Every opinion, every assessment, every expectation." She paused. "I learned to watch anyway, because what he said and what he meant were rarely the same thing." It was the first genuinely personal thing she'd offered him without his prompting. He didn't make a large thing out of it. "That's exhausting," he said. "Yes." She looked back out the window. It was. They rode the rest of the way in the kind of silence that had moved, without either of them deciding it should, from the silence of strangers to something a few degrees warmer than that. Not comfortable yet. Nothing between them was quite comfortable yet, but less like performance and more like two people being in the same space without requiring anything of each other. He flew home Sunday morning. Noah met him at the door, still in pajamas, holding the half-chewed remains of the work glove, apparently as evidence, and Diesel circled his legs twice, and the horses needed feeding, and there was a voicemail from a journalist who'd somehow found his landline number and wanted a comment, which he deleted without listening to fully. He called Victoria that evening. She was in a meeting, but she called back 20 minutes later and they talked for an hour about nothing that was in any of the briefing documents. About the cardiologist and his barbecue opinions. About Noah's theory that the buildings in New York might still be camera tricks, even given Ryan's first-hand account. About the horse named Cassius, who had, that morning, eaten most of Ryan's left work glove in what appeared to be a county-wide conspiracy targeting his handwear. She laughed at that. A real laugh. Not the short, controlled version she used socially. It caught him a little off guard, the fullness of it. After the call, he sat on the porch for a while in the cold, listening to the ranch settle into night, thinking about the way she'd said her father's expectations had been exhausting, and the tone it had been set in, not seeking sympathy, not performing damage, just a plain fact set down and left there. He thought about the ring on his finger, which he kept noticing at odd moments, the way you noticed a new weight before it became familiar. He went inside and checked on Noah, who was asleep with the light still on and a library book open across his chest. Ryan closed the book and turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment. The world was the same as it had been 3 weeks ago. Also, it wasn't. He went to bed. The stories about Ryan's past started appearing on Tuesday. He found out about them the way he found out about most things happening in the media ecosystem surrounding his wife's company. Through Elena, who called at 7:30 in the morning with the particular tone she used when delivering information she wished she didn't have. Ryan was in the barn. He had the phone in one hand and a feed bucket in the other, and Cassius was pushing his nose impatiently against Ryan's shoulder while he listened. 3 separate outlets, Elena said. 2 financial blogs and 1 tabloid. They're running a story claiming you had a business partner in 2019 who filed a civil complaint against you for breach of contract. They're framing it as evidence that you have a pattern of entering agreements you don't intend to honor. Ryan set the feed bucket down. Cassius found it immediately. The complaint was filed. It was also dismissed 4 months later when the arbitrator reviewed the contract and found the other party had misrepresented the terms of the original agreement. I know, I've already pulled the court records. The problem isn't the outcome, it's that the initial complaint is the headline. The dismissal is paragraph 9. That's how it works. Yes. A pause. There's also a suggestion in one of the pieces that Noah's mother left because of financial instability. They're implying Stop. He said it flat and quiet. Nobody writes about Noah. Whatever else they say about me, that's the line. Understood. Victoria is already having legal reach out to the outlet. I'll handle my own legal issues, Elena. Thank you. He hung up. He stood in the barn with Cassius eating beside him and the morning light coming in at an angle through the high window, and he was angry in the specific, cold way he got angry, which was nothing like the hot kind but was harder to move through. The business complaint had been a painful 2 years of his life, a partnership he'd entered in good faith that had soured when his partner had begun misrepresenting their shared assets to outside investors. He'd spent money he didn't have on legal fees to untangle himself from it, and the experience had left him distrustful of partnership agreements in general, which was one of several reasons the irony of his current situation was not lost on him. But Noah's mother was a different matter. She had left 3 years ago. The specific reasons were between him and her and nobody else, and they had managed since then to maintain a relationship structured enough that Noah had stability and saw her regularly and understood, in the limited way a 7-year-old could understand such things, that both his parents loved him, even though they didn't live together. She had not left because of financial instability. She had left because she and Ryan had grown into people who were fundamentally misaligned, and they had both known it for long enough before she went that the leaving had been less a rupture than an acknowledgement of something already true. None of that was anyone else's story to tell. He finished the morning feeding and went inside and called his attorney, the one he'd retained 3 weeks ago, a straightforward man named Jeff Gaines, who operated out of the county seat and whose primary practice was property law, but who had agreed to handle Ryan's interests in the arrangement with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who understood that unusual situations required basic good sense more than specialized expertise. "I saw it," Jeff said when Ryan called. "I've been looking at it since 6 this morning. The business complaint is public record, so there's limited recourse there, but the framing is misleading enough that we have grounds to request corrections. The stuff about your ex-wife is murkier, no names used technically. We can send a letter." "Send the letter." "Done. You should also know that I got a call yesterday from an attorney representing a firm called Meridian Consulting Group. They wanted background information about your financial history." "Who's Meridian?" "That's what I looked up this morning. Shell company. 2 layers of incorporation, but the registered agent has connections to at least 2 entities that have received money from Langford family trusts." Jeff paused. "Not Victoria's side." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "So Trevor is building a dossier." "That would be my interpretation." He thanked Jeff and sat at the kitchen table for a while. The house was quiet. Noah was at school. Diesel was under the table with his head on Ryan's foot in the heavy way dogs used to communicate solidarity. Ryan thought about Trevor's smile at the gala, that calibrated warmth, the handshake designed to communicate something. He thought about Victoria's voice when she'd said, "I know what you are, Trevor," and how she'd said it pleasantly, and what it cost a person to develop that much composure around a threat they'd been living with for years. He called her at 9:15. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was alone. "I know about the articles," she said before he could start. "I want to know what Trevor actually has. Not what he's publishing, what he's working toward. What's his legal strategy at the shareholder meeting?" His attorney filed a preliminary motion yesterday to have the marriage reviewed for validity on the grounds of fraud. The argument is that we entered the marriage specifically to satisfy a legal clause rather than as a genuine union, which would make it a fraudulent instrument. Can he make that stick? In theory, no. The clause doesn't specify the nature of the marriage. It requires only that I be legally married. We are legally married? That's the trust document's language, and it's clear. She was in lawyer mode now, which was a different register from the person he'd spoken to Sunday night, the one who'd laughed about the horse and the work glove. But Trevor's goal isn't to win the legal argument immediately. His goal is to create enough uncertainty among the board that when the shareholder meeting occurs on the 11th, key members vote to delay validation of my control pending an investigation. That delay alone gets him past Valentine's Day. So he doesn't need to prove fraud. He just needs to make enough people nervous to stall. Yes. A pause. And the articles about you are part of that. He's not trying to destroy your reputation. He's trying to make the board see you as a liability. Someone whose background raises questions. Someone whose connection to me looks transactional. Someone whose presence makes the whole picture look improvised. Ryan absorbed this. What do you need from me for the 11th? I need you there. In the boardroom. She said it carefully. I know I'll be there. Ryan, the meeting is going to be difficult. Trevor will likely say things about you directly, in that room, designed to, I said I'll be there. Not irritated, just clear. I told you from the beginning, I don't walk away from things I've agreed to. You don't need to keep checking. A silence. Then, okay. You should come to the ranch. I'm sorry? This week, before the 11th. He said it the way he said most things, simply, without excessive justification. You've been in New York managing this from a distance, which means you've been alone with it. Come out here for a few days, there's a guest room. You can work. I'm not asking you to stop working, but being somewhere different when you're under pressure is better than staying inside the same 4 walls. The pause that followed was long enough that he began to wonder if he'd miscalculated. Then she said, You're serious. I wouldn't have said it otherwise. Ryan, what do you have on Thursday that can't be managed remotely? Another pause, shorter. Nothing on Thursday, actually. Then come Thursday. Stay through Sunday. We drive to the city Monday morning for the meeting. He heard her breathing, the quiet sound of a person sitting with something they hadn't expected to be offered. All right, she said. Thursday. She arrived Thursday afternoon in a car she'd driven herself from the regional airport, which surprised him. He'd expected the car service. She got out wearing jeans that probably cost more than his farrier charged per visit, and actual boots this time, and a jacket that was still expensive but considerably more practical than what she'd worn the first day. She had a laptop bag over one shoulder and a single rolling suitcase, and she stood at the gate with the expression of someone who had been inside their own head for too long and had just stepped outside into weather. Noah had beaten Ryan to the gate by about 15 seconds and was already looking at the boots with the critical eye of a person who took footwear seriously. "Those are better," he announced. "I took advice," Victoria said. "Are they comfortable?" "More or less. You should try Dad's barn ones. They're really comfortable, but they smell bad." He considered. "Actually, don't try those." Noted. Ryan took her bag. He showed her the guest room, which was at the far end of the house, converted from a storage room 3 years ago when Noah had started having school friends stay over, and Ryan had decided having one actual functioning guest space was worth the effort. It was simple: a bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over the south pasture where the younger mares grazed. Victoria stood at the window for a moment without saying anything. He left her to it. She worked that afternoon at the kitchen table, laptop open, phone beside it, moving between calls and documents with the concentrated efficiency he'd noticed was her natural state. Noah did homework at the other end of the same table, occasionally asking her questions when he hit something he was stuck on, which she answered with a precision that seemed to genuinely surprise her. She was good at explaining things, once she adjusted for the audience, and Noah respected competence in the same direct way that most children did. Ryan made dinner, which was practical and nothing more. Chicken, vegetables, the kind of food that fed people without performing anything. He set the table and called them both, and they ate together, and it was strange and ordinary in equal measure. "This is good," Victoria said about the food in a way that suggested she meant it rather than was being polite. "It's chicken," Ryan said. "I know what it is. I don't cook." "At all?" "I have someone who stocks the refrigerator in New York. I eat a lot of things that come in containers." She said it without embarrassment, just as a fact. "I learned early that there are only so many hours in a day, and some skills have higher returns than others." "That's practical," Ryan said. "Daddy can cook everything," Noah offered, with the unguarded loyalty of someone making sure the record was accurate. "He does the barbecue thing where it takes like 8 hours, and it's really good. And the soup. And he makes really good eggs." "That's a comprehensive range," Victoria said. "He learned because of me." Noah said this matter-of-factly. "Before I was born, he probably just ate chips." "That's not entirely wrong," Ryan said. After dinner, Noah asked Victoria if she wanted to see the horses, and Ryan watched the slight recalibration in her expression, the check she ran on whether this was something she wanted or something she was supposed to want, and then the smaller shift when she decided it was, genuinely, something she wanted. They went out to the paddock in the cooling evening, Noah explaining each horse with the expertise of a person who'd grown up around them, and Ryan stood at the fence watching Victoria approach Cassius with the wariness of someone who respected the size of the animal and the uncertainty of its mood. Cassius was, in Ryan's assessment, the most reliably gentle animal he owned, but he also had the habit of moving suddenly toward things that interested him, which Victoria discovered when he dropped his head and pushed his nose firmly against her shoulder. She startled backward and hit the fence rail, and Ryan moved to steady her by instinct, a hand on her arm, which she didn't pull away from. And Noah said, "He likes you. That's how he says hi." And Victoria looked at the horse, and then at her own reaction, and made a small sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale. "He's enormous up close," she said. "He's average," Noah said helpfully. "For a horse, maybe. He won't hurt you. He's the nice one." Noah had already moved to the younger mares and was describing them with equal authority. Ryan let go of her arm. She straightened her jacket and looked at Cassius again, and this time she let herself stay with the uncertainty instead of pulling back from it. She lifted one hand, slowly, and let him smell it, and Cassius did, and then she touched the side of his face. "He's warm," she said quietly, in a tone that wasn't reporting information so much as noticing it. "Yeah," Ryan said. They stood at the fence for a while after that, Noah's voice a running commentary in the background, the evening settling around them. And nothing about it was particularly significant except that it was, in some way Ryan didn't try to name, different from every previous moment in the weeks they'd been doing this. The next 2 days had a rhythm to them that surprised both of them, probably for different reasons. Victoria worked mornings in the kitchen, her calls muffled through the door when she took them privately, her focus complete in the way of someone who had never learned to do anything at half capacity. Ryan worked the ranch, fence repairs, the water system, the slow, ongoing maintenance of land that needed attention all the time and most of it unglamorous. Noah went to school and came back and occupied the space between them with the unconscious ease of a child who hadn't yet learned to require the adults around him to be settled before he could be. Friday evening, she asked Ryan to show her the north pasture, which he'd mentioned in passing and which she'd asked about directly, and they walked out there as the sun was going down. The dry grass flattened by the cold, the land wide and empty in the way that made some people uncomfortable and other people feel something closer to relief. "My grandfather had a piece of land in Connecticut," she said, walking beside him. "Not like this, smaller, more wooded. He used to take me there when I was small, before the company was what it is now." She paused. "After he died, my father sold it within the first year, said it was an underperforming asset." Ryan said nothing. He'd learned that she continued when she wasn't prompted and stopped when she was, which was another of the things that had clarified over these weeks. "I was 13, she said. "I didn't say anything about it because you didn't say anything about my father's decisions. That's how it worked." She looked at the pasture. "I've been thinking about that lately. How much I didn't say. What would you have said if you had?" She was quiet for a moment. "That it wasn't just land, that he built something there. My grandfather, I mean. That selling it to optimize a portfolio was technically correct, and also completely missed the point." Ryan looked at the fence line, the cedar trees at the far edge catching the last light. "That's still true of the company." She turned to look at him. "He built something," Ryan said. "The women's fund, the 4,000 employees, all of it. Your father optimized. You're trying to preserve something you understand the value of, which is different from just wanting to win." He paused. "Trevor only sees the winning part. That's the actual difference between you." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he'd seen before in fragments, that unguarded thing under the surface. But this time it stayed visible longer. "You do that," she said. "Do what?" "Find the actual thing. The thing underneath the other thing." She looked back at the pasture. "You don't let people stay in the comfortable version of what they're saying." "I'm not sure that's always a kindness." "It isn't, sometimes." A pause. "It mostly is." They walked back as the stars were becoming visible, and the conversation moved into simpler things, and neither of them mentioned what had been said, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Saturday morning, Ryan found her on the porch at 6:15 with coffee, which was earlier than he'd expected. She was in what he was beginning to recognize as her off-duty configuration, the looser hair, the less armored posture, and she was looking out at the pasture with an expression that was close to the one she'd had at the window the first day. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "I slept fine, actually." She said it like it surprised her. "I just woke up early." He sat down. They drank coffee in the early quiet, diesel between their chairs in the cold air, and after a while she said, "I want to talk about the 11th. "Okay." "Trevor's going to attack in that room, directly, personally. He's going to say things about the marriage, about you, about my judgment. He is very good at it. He makes it sound concerned rather than hostile, and that's the dangerous version." She held the mug in both hands. "I need you to know that in advance so that when it happens, you're not caught off guard." "I won't be." "I know, but I also need you to know—" She stopped, started again. "I need you to know that whatever he says, I don't agree with any of it. And not because we have an arrangement, because it's not true." She looked at him. "You have been more honest with me in 3 weeks than most people in my professional life have been in years. I don't know exactly what that says about my professional life, but I wanted you to know that I know it." Ryan held her gaze. It was early and quiet, and the horses were beginning to move in the paddock, and the moment had a weight to it that neither of them was pretending it didn't have. "Okay," he said. "That's it? What else would you like me to say?" She looked at her coffee. The corner of her mouth moved. "Nothing, I suppose." Noah appeared at the door in pajamas and dinosaur socks, hair catastrophic, holding his library book. He looked at both of them with the alert radar of a child who detected an unusual atmospheric condition in adults and chose to pretend he hadn't. "Is there cereal?" he asked. "Yes," Ryan said. "The good kind or the other kind?" "Both." "The good kind." He disappeared back inside and they heard the cabinet opening. Victoria watched the door where he'd been. Something settled in her face that was quiet and not unhappy. "He's something," she said. "Yeah." Ryan looked at the door too. "He is." She left Sunday afternoon, the way she'd arrived, herself in the rental car with the laptop bag and the rolling case. She stood at the gate saying goodbye to Noah, who had spent the morning showing her his drawing collection with the seriousness of a gallery curator, and she had looked at each one with the attention he deserved. And when she said goodbye, she said it to him directly, not the way adults sometimes said it to children, across them, to the parent, but to Noah, looking at him. He'd hugged her, which Ryan hadn't expected. Noah was selective about physical affection with people he didn't know well, and the hug was brief and practical rather than dramatic, but Victoria's expression in the second it lasted was the most undefended thing Ryan had ever seen on her face. She straightened up and looked at Ryan. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he said. She drove down the road and the car raised a small trail of dust against the winter sky, and Noah stood at the gate watching it go. "She's nice," Noah said. "Yes," Ryan said. Different from what she looked like the first day. Ryan looked at his son. What did she look like the first day? Noah thought about it with the seriousness he brought to accurate description. "Like someone whose shoes hurt," he said. Ryan looked back at the road. The dust was settling. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that." They went inside and Ryan washed the mugs from the morning and Noah went to find his library book. And Monday was 2 days away with a boardroom in it and a cousin who smiled with the practiced warmth of something that had learned to look like a person. And whatever had shifted between Ryan and Victoria over 4 days on a ranch in Texas was now going to have to survive the thing it had been built to withstand. He dried the mugs and put them back on the shelf. He thought about her face when Noah had hugged her. He put the dish towel down and went to check the horses. They drove to New York on Monday morning in Victoria's car, leaving the ranch at 4:30 so Ryan could make the early flight out of the regional airport. He'd arranged for Dale to take Noah for 2 nights, which Noah received as a bonus vacation and Ryan received as the particular guilt of a parent who knew his child was fine and felt bad anyway. The flight was 2 hours. Victoria had a car waiting at JFK and they rode into the city in the gray February morning, both of them tired, neither of them performing anything. She had her laptop open and was reviewing documents, and he looked out the window at the city assembling itself in the winter light, and they'd been doing this long enough now that the silence between them didn't require management. "The meeting starts at 9, she said without looking up. "I know." Trevor's attorney filed an amended motion late last night. They're adding a clause arguing that the trust requires evidence of a bona fide marital relationship, not merely a legal certificate. She turned a page. "My attorney says the trust language doesn't support that interpretation, but it gives Trevor something to argue in the room." What does bona fide mean in legal terms here? Cohabitation, shared finances, demonstrated emotional relationship, things that take time to establish. She finally looked up. Things we haven't had time to establish on paper. Ryan thought about the ranch, the coffee on the porch, Noah's hug at the gate, the north pasture at dusk. "We'll manage," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he knew by now, the one that was checking whether he understood the full weight of what he was saying. He looked back at her steadily, the way he did, and she turned back to her documents. "Yes," she said. "We will." The Langford Capital offices occupied 4 floors of a building in Midtown, and the boardroom was on the top floor with windows that looked out over the city the way Victoria had described. Harbor visible on a clear day, though February gave them only a flat white sky pressing down on the skyline. Ryan had been in the elevator, checked in with security, handed a visitor badge that said R. Carter, guest, which he found mildly absurd given everything, and was now sitting in a chair against the wall of the boardroom, waiting for 9 o'clock with a coffee he'd poured from a credenza and was mostly using as something to hold. The room filled over 20 minutes. 14 board members, 4 attorneys distributed between the two sides of the dispute, Elena near the door with her tablet, and 2 observers from an institutional investment group whose presence Victoria had flagged as significant. They held a 9% stake and had not committed to either side. Trevor arrived at 8:58, which was deliberate. He entered with 2 people Ryan didn't recognize and a third who had the bearing of a senior attorney. Older, silver-haired, the kind of calm that came from 50 years of being the most prepared person in a room. Trevor scanned the room with the practiced ease of someone who'd been preparing for this for months, and when his eyes landed on Ryan, he smiled the same smile he'd produced at the gala. Ryan nodded at him once and looked away. Victoria was at the head of the table. She was wearing dark navy, her hair pulled back in the way that meant she was fully armored, and she was speaking quietly to her own attorney, a woman named Patricia Howe, who was compact and fast-moving and who, Ryan had gathered over 2 conversations, was not someone Trevor's side particularly wanted to argue with. Victoria caught Ryan's eye briefly when he looked her way. He gave her a small nod. She turned back to Patricia. The meeting was called to order by the board chair, a man named Gerald Whitfield, who had the careful neutrality of someone trying to hold a room full of opposed forces at a consistent temperature. He outlined the agenda. Trevor's motion challenging the validity of the marriage as a qualifying instrument under the trust, Victoria's response, and a vote on whether to delay validation pending further review. Trevor's attorney went first. He was good. Ryan had expected good, and this was better than that. The kind of careful, methodical argument that was designed to sound reasonable while constructing a structure that was not reasonable at all. The core of it was simple, that the trust requirement of marriage was intended by its author to ensure that the executive chairholder had personal stability and accountability, and that a marriage entered solely to satisfy that clause, and entered, notably, 11 days before the deadline with a man who had no prior known connection to the family, was precisely the kind of arrangement the clause was designed to preclude. He did not use the word fraudulent once. He used words like expedient and unconventional timing and raises reasonable questions and the board's fiduciary obligation to investigate. And by the end of it, Ryan could see 2 of the board members who'd been neutral when they walked in looking at the table in a way that meant they were reconsidering. Then Patricia Howe stood up. She was 20 minutes, methodical, and the legal architecture she constructed was airtight. The trust's language was clear, the marriage was valid under Texas law, the clause specified no minimum duration of courtship, and the concept of bona fide had no basis in the document's actual text. She placed certified copies of the marriage certificate, the license application, and the courthouse records in front of each board member with the efficiency of someone who'd done this exact motion before and found it unambiguous. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Trevor spoke. He didn't go through his attorney. He spoke directly, which Ryan recognized as the move of someone who'd decided the legal argument wasn't enough and was switching to the personal one. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked down the table at Victoria with an expression of what appeared to be genuine concern. "I want to be clear," he said, "that this is not personal. Victoria knows I have nothing but respect for what she's accomplished, but I think we all have an obligation to ask the obvious question." He paused. "Mr. Carter." He turned and looked directly at Ryan across the room. "You met my cousin. How recently? 4 weeks ago?" Ryan said nothing. "You're a rancher from rural Texas with no connection to this industry, this family, or this company. You married a woman you barely knew 11 days before a legal deadline that happens to be worth approximately $3 billion in company control." He let that sit. "And you expect this board to accept that this is a genuine marriage rather than a transaction." The room was very still. Ryan put down his coffee cup. He looked at Trevor for a moment. The practiced concern, the calibrated timing, the smile that was still, faintly, there at the corners. He'd been in rooms with people like this before, smaller scale, but the same essential character. And the thing he'd learned was that they relied on their target doing one of 2 things, either erupting in a way that looked defensive or going quiet in a way that looked guilty. He did neither. "I'm not here to convince you of anything," Ryan said. His voice was even and carried without being raised. If you've decided what this is, no answer I give is going to change that, and we both know it. He held Trevor's gaze. So let me just say one thing, and then you can go back to your motion. Trevor's expression didn't change, but something in it adjusted. I didn't marry Victoria because of $3 billion, Ryan said. I don't have a use for $3 billion. I have 40 acres in Texas, a horse with bad manners, and a 7-year-old son who needs dinner on the table at 6 o'clock. He paused. What I saw when your cousin showed up at my property was someone carrying a weight that would have put most people on the ground and doing it alone, and not asking anyone for help. Not really asking because she'd spent her whole life learning not to. He looked at the board, not at Trevor, because the board was who this actually mattered to. That's not a transaction. I don't know what you call it, but it's not that. The room was quiet. Trevor's smile had thinned. That's a very moving answer. It doesn't address the timeline. 4 weeks is how long it's been, Ryan said. Some things take longer, some don't. He looked at Trevor directly. You've known her your whole life. You're still trying to take everything she built. Something genuinely cold passed through Trevor's expression for the first time since he'd walked in. Not the surface cool, but something underneath it, the thing the warmth was a cover for. He recovered within 2 seconds, but several people in the room had been looking directly at him, and the recovery itself was visible. Victoria had not moved during any of this. She was looking at Ryan with an expression he'd never seen on her before, and he couldn't name it then and wouldn't be able to name it later, but he knew it wasn't the armored expression, and it wasn't the controlled one, and it had nothing to do with the boardroom. Gerald Whitfield cleared his throat. I think we should move to the evidence portion of the agenda. But Patricia Howe had been thorough, but what she placed on the table in the next 20 minutes was more than thorough. It was the kind of evidence that had clearly been assembled over weeks and required significant resources, and Ryan, watching the board members' faces as they worked through it, understood that Victoria had not been simply defending herself during these weeks. She had been building something. The documents outlined a pattern of financial manipulation inside Langford Capital's asset management division going back 4 years. Transactions routed through a subsidiary that Trevor chaired into vehicles that technically complied with company policy but had been structured specifically to obscure their ultimate beneficiary. The ultimate beneficiary, across 17 separate transactions, was a holding entity with Trevor Langford's name on the registration document. It was not embezzlement in the simple sense. It was more sophisticated and more damaging than that. It was the systematic positioning of company assets in ways that would benefit Trevor's personal portfolio when certain structural changes occurred, which were precisely the structural changes he'd been advocating for publicly for 2 years. He hadn't been arguing for the dismantling of Langford Capital because it was good strategy. He'd been arguing for it because he owned pieces of the entities that would absorb it. The room's temperature changed. Patricia walked through it methodically, citing the document number for each exhibit, connecting each transaction to Trevor's account, and doing it all without visible satisfaction, as if it were simply a set of facts being placed in order. The board members who'd been uncertain an hour ago were now very still and very focused. Carolyn Marsh, the swing vote, was reading the exhibits with an expression that had passed through surprise and arrived somewhere harder. Trevor's attorney leaned over and whispered something. Trevor shook his head, barely. I'd like to respond to these allegations, Trevor said. His voice was controlled, but it was a different kind of controlled, the kind that was working for it now. These are unverified documents that have been selectively assembled to— They've been verified, Patricia said. The third exhibit is a forensic accounting analysis prepared by an independent firm retained 6 weeks ago. The fifth exhibit is a certified record from the state comptroller's office. If counsel would like to review the chain of custody on each— I'd like a recess, Trevor's attorney said. There's no provision for recess in this proceeding, Gerald Whitfield said. He said it gently, but he said it. Trevor looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the documents. The particular silence that followed was the silence of a calculated position collapsing under the weight of what it had been built on, and it had a specific quality. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the flat and irreversible sound of something ending. Victoria spoke. She'd been quiet through all of it, through Ryan's statement, through Patricia's presentation, through Trevor's attempted response. She stood now, without notes, and when she spoke, her voice was the steady, clear voice of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and was about to set it down. "I want to address the board directly," she said. "Not through counsel, not through documents. Directly." She looked around the table. "Trevor has been positioning himself for this moment for 2 years. I knew it. Some of you knew it. We proceeded because the evidence wasn't sufficient to act on, and because in this family, in this company, there is a long tradition of giving people the benefit of the doubt that they have not earned." She paused. "That ends today." She walked through it without theater, connecting the financial evidence to the public advocacy, showing the board exactly how Trevor's stated business philosophy mapped onto his private financial interests. She was precise, and she was devastating, and she was not angry, which was, Ryan thought, watching from his chair against the wall, the most powerful version of what she was doing. Anger would have given Trevor something to respond to. This gave him nothing. "I entered this marriage in circumstances that were unusual," she said near the end. She didn't look at Ryan when she said it, which he understood was because looking at him would have been performing something. "The timeline was not conventional. But my grandfather's trust does not require convention. It requires commitment to this company, to its people, to its purpose." She looked at Carolyn Marsh specifically for a moment, then moved on. "I have been committed to those things my entire adult life. The question before this board today is not whether my marriage meets some undefined standard of romance. The question is whether you trust what these documents show and whether you trust what 12 years of my record demonstrates." She sat down. "I'll leave that to your judgment." The vote was called 35 minutes later, after 2 procedural exchanges that Ryan only partially followed. Gerald Whitfield read the question as written, which was whether to delay validation of Victoria's trust control pending further investigation of the marriage's validity. 11 votes against delay. 2 for. 1 abstention. Trevor's motion failed. The room did not erupt because these were not people who erupted. There were conversations, movements, the sound of chairs and papers, and the particular noise of a formal proceeding unwinding into ordinary activity. Trevor's attorney was already on his phone. Trevor himself sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table in front of him, looking at nothing. And in that moment, the warmth was entirely gone. And what was left was just a man who had bet on the wrong thing and knew it. He stood, gathered his folder, and left without speaking to anyone. Victoria was immediately surrounded. Board members, Patricia, the institutional investors who'd been observing, all of them wanting a moment of her attention. Ryan stayed in his chair. He was not part of this part, and he knew it, and he was fine with that. He refilled his coffee from the credenza and watched the room and waited. It was 20 minutes before she got free. She crossed to where he was standing and stopped in front of him, and the room was still active around them, people still talking, and she looked at him with the expression he hadn't been able to name from across the table. "You didn't have to say what you said," she told him. "Legally, you didn't have to say anything." "I know. It wasn't in the plan. Plans change." She looked at him. Her composure was intact, as it always was, but there was something underneath it that he could read by now, the way you learn to read weather on a particular piece of land, the specific pressure of something building. "You meant it," she said. "What you said about—" She stopped. "Yes," he said. He didn't make her finish it. She nodded once, looked away briefly, then back. "We need to make about 6 more appearances in this room today, and then there's a statement for the press, and then I have 3 attorney calls." "I know." He put down the coffee cup. "Go do your job." She held his gaze for another second, and in that second he thought she was going to say something else, something that wasn't logistical. Then Elena appeared at her shoulder with a tablet and a look of professional urgency, and the moment passed, and Victoria turned back into the executive, and the room continued around them. Ryan found a chair in the corner and sat with his phone and texted Dale to check on Noah. "He's good," currently explaining to my dog why dinosaurs were better than horses, and looked out the window at the flat February sky and thought about what he'd said in the room, which he hadn't planned, and which had been completely true. The harbor was visible today, just barely, a thin silver line at the edge of the white sky. He thought about Noah asking whether the buildings were really that tall. He thought about Victoria's face when Noah had hugged her at the gate. He thought about the north pasture at dusk, and the way she'd said, "That's the actual difference between you," and looked at him like he'd handed her something she'd been looking for without knowing its name. The press statement took an hour. The attorney calls took 2. By the time they were in the car heading back to the hotel, it was nearly 7 in the evening and the city was fully dark, and neither of them said anything for a while. And Ryan sat with the feeling that something had shifted again, not gradually this time, but specifically, in a room with 14 people watching. In the moment, he'd said what was true without calculating whether it was useful. "Trevor will be removed from the board by end of week," Victoria said eventually. "The attorneys are already filing. There may be a regulatory investigation. The comptroller's involvement almost guarantees it." She was looking out the window. "It's going to be a complicated few months. But the company is safe." "Yes." A pause. "The company is safe." The car moved through the evening traffic, and the city pressed against the windows on all sides. And Ryan thought that safe was an interesting word for what had happened in that room today. Because what it actually meant was that 4,000 people still had jobs, and 60,000 women still had a fund, and 30 years of something worth building was still intact, and that all of that had been worth the past 3 weeks, worth every strange and complicated thing, worth the photographs in parking lots, and the articles about his past, and Trevor's handshake at the gala, and the suit from Hugh's shop, and every morning phone call from a hotel room too far from his ranch. He looked at the ring on his hand. Worth all of it, and then some things beyond that which he wasn't quite ready to name yet. "You should eat something," he said. She turned from the window. "I'm fine." "You've said that about 30 times since I met you, and about 10 of them were accurate." He looked at her. "When did you last eat?" She thought about it. The fact that she had to think about it was the answer. "There's a place 2 blocks from the hotel," he said. "Nothing fancy. You get actual food and you eat it." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "I said okay, Ryan. Just checking." The car found the hotel, and they walked the 2 blocks in the February cold. And it was a small Italian place with paper on the tables and a noise level that was exactly right for 2 people who didn't need to talk about everything just yet. And they sat across from each other and ordered food and ate it, and it was imperfect and quiet and very close to something that didn't feel like an arrangement at all. They flew home the next morning. Not home to New York, not home to the hotel, home to Texas, to the ranch, because Ryan had a water pump that needed inspection, and Noah had a school project due Thursday, and Dale's dog had apparently eaten a second glove, and someone needed to address the systemic nature of that problem. Victoria sat beside him on the flight with her laptop open, as she always did, but she wasn't working the same way she usually worked. She'd open a document, read 3 lines, close it, open her email, scroll without responding, close it. She looked out the window a lot. Ryan didn't say anything about it. He read a maintenance manual for the pump system and let her be inside whatever she was working through. She came to the ranch because it was where the car was going, and she hadn't said otherwise, which he counted as a decision. Dale brought Noah back at noon, and Noah launched himself at Ryan with the full-body commitment of a child who had been away one night and treated it with the emotional weight of a longer expedition, and then looked at Victoria and said, "You're back," with a matter-of-factness that was, Ryan thought, the most generous possible way to receive her. "I'm back," she said. "Did you win?" "Yes." "Good." He picked up his backpack and went inside to look for a snack, which was the extent of the debrief he required. Dale caught Ryan's eye over the roof of the car with an expression that communicated several things without words. Primarily, "I have questions, and I'll ask them later," and drove back down the road. Victoria stood in the yard with her rolling case and her laptop bag, and the particular expression of someone who had been moving at high velocity for weeks and had just stopped and wasn't sure yet what stillness felt like. "Guest room's the same," Ryan said. "I know where it is." She stayed 3 days. They were different days from the ones before the board meeting. The crisis had been the structure around which everything had organized, and without it, the days had a looser shape, not empty, but open in a way that required both of them to decide what to do with it. Victoria worked, but differently, the focused emergency mode replaced by the steadier rhythm of someone managing a company that was no longer under immediate threat. She took calls from the porch sometimes, looking out at the pasture while she spoke in the clipped, precise language of executive decisions, and Ryan would pass through, and she'd catch his eye, and there would be a brief moment of acknowledgement, still here, still okay, that had become a kind of private shorthand. In the evenings, they sat on the porch after Noah went to bed, and they talked, not about the company, not about Trevor, not about the legal proceedings that were now working their way through the system without requiring her constant management. They talked the way people talked when the urgent thing was over and what was left was just each other, about her grandfather's Connecticut land and what she'd never said about losing it, about Ryan's father who had communicated almost entirely through action and had left Ryan both the capacity for patience and a lifelong difficulty asking for things he needed, about Noah's mother, which Ryan brought up himself one evening because he wanted her to have the accurate version and not whatever Trevor's research team had assembled. She didn't leave because of money, he said. They were sitting in the evening cold, the stars out in full, Diesel between their chairs. We were the wrong fit. We both knew it for 2 years before she went. She's a good person, and she's a good mother, and we just didn't work past a certain point. Victoria looked at her coffee. Was it hard? Yes, mostly because of Noah, not because of us. He paused. There was a period where I was angry, not at her specifically, just at the shape of it. The fact that I'd built something with a person and the building had collapsed. He looked out at the dark pasture. That passed. What replaced it was mostly just trying to do the right thing for Noah, every day, which turns out to be a full-time project. She was quiet for a moment. You're good at that. The everyday part. I've had practice. It's not just practice. Some people have the practice and don't develop the patience. She said it plainly, not as a compliment performed for effect, just as an observation. My father had more practice with me than he knew what to do with, and he never quite managed consistent. What was he like? She thought about it. Brilliant, genuinely. He understood capital markets the way some people understand music, intuitively at a level that bypassed analysis. She wrapped both hands around her mug. But he thought love was a resource like any other, finite, better allocated to high-return recipients. She paused. I was not always a high-return recipient as a child. Ryan said nothing. He understood the specific silence that was the right response to that kind of statement. He got better, she said, before he died. We had some good years. She looked at the stars. I just wish I hadn't spent so long thinking that the way he'd taught me to operate was the only way. A pause. Coming here made me think about that this place, Noah, the way you... She stopped, started again. The way you just are with him, without calculation. It made me realize I'd been calculating everything for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't mandatory. Ryan looked at her. The stars were very bright, and the night was very quiet, and she was sitting in the cold with her coffee and her hair loose, and the armor genuinely down, not strategically lowered for a purpose, just down. And he thought about the first night she'd stood on this porch with a mug she didn't drink from, and how far that felt from this. You're not bad at the non-calculating version, he said, in case no one's told you. She looked at him. Noah's told me. Noah's 7. Noah has excellent judgment. Ryan smiled at the dark pasture. He really does. She left on a Thursday, the day before Valentine's Day. The timing was not lost on either of them. The deadline that had started all of it was tomorrow, and it was satisfied, and the arrangement had served its purpose, and the path forward, as written in their contract, was clear enough. A quiet filing in a few months. An amicable and confidential separation. 2 people returning to their respective lives with the legal document and a story they'd never fully tell. That was the plan. She'd put her rolling case in the car and her laptop bag and was standing at the gate in the morning light, and Noah was at school, and Ryan had walked out to the gate because walking someone to their car was a basic human courtesy, and also because he hadn't figured out what to say yet and was hoping the walk would help. It didn't particularly help. She stood at the gate and looked at the house and then at him. I want to say something, she said. Okay. I don't know how to say it without it sounding like... She stopped. She looked at the ground briefly, which was something he'd never seen her do before. And when she looked back up, her expression had the quality of someone who had decided to stop editing. You changed something. In me. The way I think about things. About what I want. About what's worth. I came here with a contract and a problem to solve, and I thought I understood every variable, and I was wrong about several of them. She held his gaze. I was wrong about you specifically. I thought you'd be useful. I didn't expect you to be... She paused. I didn't expect this. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He thought about what he'd said in the boardroom. I stopped seeing her as a billionaire in need of a husband, and how true it had been and how he'd known it was true before he said it, had known it for a while, had been letting himself know it in pieces the way you approach something you were uncertain of. What are you trying to say, Victoria? She exhaled, a short, slightly frustrated breath, which was the most unguarded version of herself he'd ever seen. I'm trying to say that I don't want the contract to be the end of this. The morning was quiet. A horse moved somewhere behind him, and the cedar trees were still, and the sky was the pale blue of early Texas February, and he stood there with a woman he'd married 4 weeks ago under the most logistically unusual circumstances he could imagine, and who had looked at his son's drawings with genuine attention and had let a horse press his face against her shoulder, and had said, "That's the actual difference between you on a dark pasture," and had laughed on the phone about a work glove with the full, unguarded version of her laugh. It's not the end, he said. She looked at him carefully. Ryan, I know what you're asking. My answer is it's not the end. He said it simply, the way he said things that were true and didn't require ornament. What happens next, we figure out. But it's not the end. Something moved through her face that wasn't the controlled expression and wasn't the unguarded one he'd been seeing in pieces. It was something older than both, the expression of a person receiving something they'd stopped expecting. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I live in New York. I know. The company needs me in the city. A lot. I know that too. Noah is here. Your life is here. Yes. So how does this... I don't know yet, he said. Neither do you. That's fine. He held her gaze. Some things you figure out as you go. You know that. You've been doing that your whole life, just while pretending you had a plan. She stared at him. Then slowly, a real smile. Not the controlled social version, not the brief, slightly suppressed one he'd seen occasionally, but the full thing, the one that changed her whole face, the one that made her look like someone who had finally stopped working so hard at being someone other than this. You're very irritating, she said. Consistently, he agreed. She stepped toward him, and he didn't step back, and she put her hand against the side of his face. The way you touch something you were finally letting yourself want. And he covered her hand with his own, and they stood there at the gate of his ranch on the morning before Valentine's Day, and nothing about it was cinematic or orchestrated or perfectly timed, and it was exactly right. The weeks that followed were not simple. That was the honest version, and it's worth telling the honest version because the simplified one, they figured it out, and it was fine, misses everything that made it true. Trevor Langford resigned from the Langford Capital Board on February 20th under pressure from 6 board members and the preliminary results of the comptroller's investigation. The formal regulatory filing came in March, and the case against him moved through the legal system with the slow, grinding thoroughness that white-collar financial cases required. Not dramatic, not resolved quickly, but resolved. He retained his personal assets, most of them, because that was how it usually worked, but the path he'd constructed toward the company was permanently closed, and the 4 years of careful positioning had produced nothing except a legal bill and a family relationship that was now entirely destroyed. Victoria handled the press statement herself, without theater. She expressed disappointment, noted the evidence, affirmed the company's commitment to governance standards, and declined to editorialize further. Ryan read it at the kitchen table and thought it was exactly right. Not cold, not performative, just the plain thing. The Women's Economic Development Fund was not only preserved, but refinanced with an expanded mandate. Victoria announced this quietly in an internal memo before any public statement, because the people who ran the fund had been waiting anxiously, and they deserved to know first. 4,200 direct employees kept their jobs. The arrangement, as written in the contract, required a quiet dissolution in several months. They filed nothing. Neither of them brought it up, which was its own kind of conversation. What they had instead was this. Victoria came to the ranch for 10 days in March, working remotely, and she and Noah built a birdhouse on a Saturday afternoon, with the project taking 3 times longer than planned because Noah had strong opinions about the placement of the entry hole, and Victoria, who had been running a billion-dollar company for 3 years, met her match in a 7-year-old with a ruler and a firm commitment to engineering accuracy. Ryan watched from the porch and drank coffee and did not offer to mediate. The birdhouse was imperfect and structurally sound, and Noah put it on the fence post near the garden, and a pair of house sparrows moved in within 2 weeks, which Noah took as personal validation and Victoria received as the most genuinely satisfying outcome of any project she'd managed in recent memory. In April, Ryan flew to New York with Noah for a long weekend. Victoria met them at the airport, and Noah walked out of the terminal and looked up at the buildings and stopped completely, mouth open, and then turned to Ryan and said, "They're actually that tall," in a tone of profound personal revision, and Victoria caught Ryan's eye over Noah's head with a look that was private and warm and belonged entirely to them. She showed Noah the harbor view from the office building on a Saturday morning when the floors were empty. He stood at the window for 10 solid minutes, very still, looking at the water and the distant structures and the enormous fact of the city spread out below him, and when he finally turned around, his face had the expression of someone who had been handed a larger world than the one he'd been carrying. "I want to come back," he said. "You can come back whenever you want," Victoria told him. "Promise?" She looked at him, and Ryan saw her land on the word, its weight, its implications, the specific thing a 7-year-old meant when he asked for a promise. And instead of finding a diplomatic alternative, she said, "Yes, I promise." Noah nodded, satisfied, and went back to looking at the harbor. Ryan said nothing. He didn't need to. The practical questions were real, and they worked through them the way you worked through real things. Not in one conversation, not tidily, but over many evenings and phone calls and mornings on the porch, and dinners at the kitchen table with Noah asking questions that were sometimes inconveniently precise. What would school look like if they spent time in New York? What would the ranch look like if Victoria spent more time in Texas? What the company needed, what Noah needed, what both of them needed as people who were not willing to be the kind of couple that sacrificed one life entirely for another. There were arguments, real ones, not the explosive kind, but the kind that come from two people who both have strong convictions and limited tolerance for being managed. Victoria had a way of converting emotional conversations into logistical frameworks when they got difficult, which Ryan found infuriating in the specific way that only happens when you understand exactly why a person does the thing that frustrates you. Ryan had a way of going quiet when he was processing something significant, which Victoria experienced as withdrawal when it was actually the opposite. And she told him so directly, and he heard it, and they worked on it, imperfectly and continuously, the way you worked on things that mattered. She learned to sit with uncertainty, slowly. He learned to say things before they were fully formed, which was harder than it sounded for a person who'd spent years waiting until he knew exactly what was true before he offered it. They got it wrong sometimes. They corrected. Noah, who had never been a child who required perfect circumstances to feel secure, navigated all of it with the equanimity of someone whose fundamental world, his father, the ranch, the horses, dinner at 6, had remained intact. Victoria wasn't replacing anything. She was adding something, and Noah's emotional architecture was sturdy enough to receive additions without threatening the load-bearing walls. He called her Victoria for about 2 months, then shifted without announcement or ceremony to a different configuration. Not mom. He had a mother, a good one, and that word was not available and nobody asked him to offer it. Something else, something of his own coining. A nickname that came out of a private joke about the birdhouse engineering disagreement, and that meant nothing to anyone outside their specific triangle, which was exactly the point. It was theirs. It wasn't borrowed. By summer, the rhythm of their life had found a shape that wasn't tidy, but was real. Victoria spent 2 weeks of every month in New York, and 2 weeks at the ranch or wherever Ryan and Noah were. And the company operated well under this arrangement because she'd built a team capable of genuine function rather than the kind of team that required her constant presence, which turned out to be the difference between a company that worked and a company that performed working. She was a better executive with space. She'd known this theoretically. Actually living it was a separate discovery. Ryan hired a part-time hand for the ranch to manage the days when he was traveling, which he did occasionally, more than before, to New York, once to London, for an industry event Victoria needed him at, and which he attended in Hui's suit and managed with the self-contained equanimity that characterized his engagement with every world that wasn't his own. He didn't pretend to be comfortable in boardrooms or at charity galas. He was himself in them, which it turned out was more useful than comfortable would have been. Dale Pritchard, who had watched all of this with the patient attention of a genuinely good friend, said on one summer evening on Ryan's porch, "You seem different." Ryan considered this. How? Less contained. Dale looked at the pasture. Not worse. Just less like you're holding everything at a specific distance. Ryan thought about that for a moment. Yeah, he said. Maybe. She's good for you. She's a lot of things. He paused. She's good for me. Dale nodded and didn't push further because he was a person who understood when something had been said fully enough. The formal legal dissolution of the original arrangement was never filed. There was a conversation with Patricia Howe in June about the prenuptial agreement, which was amended rather than terminated, adjusted to reflect a different reality than the one it had been written to govern, because the people it described had changed, and the document should accurately describe the people, not the prior version. Patricia handled it without comment, which Ryan appreciated. The press found a different story over time. The early coverage, arranged marriage for trust clause, Texas rancher hired as husband, gave way to less sensational mentions, and then to occasional profile pieces that Ryan refused to participate in, and Victoria handled with the brevity of someone who'd decided the work was more interesting than the narrative. There was one journalist, a woman from a financial magazine who'd been covering Victoria for years, who wrote a piece in the fall that was accurate in the important ways. It described Victoria as someone who had, in one of the most difficult years of her professional life, made a series of decisions that looked impulsive from the outside and turned out to be the most sound decisions she'd made in her career. Not because they were strategically optimal, but because they were honest. Victoria read the piece and didn't comment on it publicly. Privately, she sent it to Ryan with a single message. She got most of it right. Ryan read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with coffee going cold and Noah eating cereal across from him. She got most of it right. He thought about what the journalist had gotten right and what she'd necessarily missed, because the actual story, the real texture of it, the specific weight of it, lived in things that didn't appear in any article. It lived in the morning. Victoria had found Cassius unlatched from his stall and spent 40 minutes coaxing him back in with patient, increasingly mud-covered determination before accepting Ryan's help, by which point she was too invested to not see it through herself. It lived in the phone call at midnight when the regulatory filing against Trevor had hit a complication, and she'd called not Elena, not Patricia, but Ryan, and talked for 2 hours not about the legal mechanics, but about the fact that she was tired in the specific way you got tired from carrying something for a long time and being almost done, but not yet. It lived in the moment 3 months ago when Noah had come home from school with a drawing, not of a horse fighting a Komodo dragon, not of a building or a landscape, but of 3 people standing in front of what was identifiably their porch, 2 adults and a kid, and the kid had given all 3 of them the same shade of crayon sky above their heads. Noah had handed it to Victoria without ceremony. "It's us," he said. "I can see that," she said. Her voice had been even. Her hands had not been. She'd put it in her bag. Later, Ryan had found it in the apartment in New York, framed, on the desk where she worked. She hadn't mentioned it. Neither had he. There was a morning in October, one of those Texas October mornings that felt like an apology for summer, cool and gold and generous, when Victoria came out to the porch before Ryan was up, which was unusual because she was not naturally an early riser outside of professional obligation, and she was sitting in his chair with his coffee mug when he came out at 5:45. He stood in the doorway. "You're in my chair. Your chair has the better view." "They're the same chairs." "They're not, actually. This one is slightly angled toward the cedar trees, and yours faces more of the open pasture, and the open pasture has more—" She paused. "You know this. I know this." He went inside and came back with the other mug and sat in her chair, which she was correct was slightly less well-positioned, and they sat in the early gold light while the horses moved in the far paddock, and Diesel navigated from one chair to the other, trying to distribute his attention fairly. After a while, Victoria said, "I've been thinking about the fund." "Which one?" "The Women's Development Fund. The 60,000 women." She held the mug in both hands, which was how she'd held every mug she'd ever held on this porch. "We've been operating on an 8-year-old mandate. I want to expand it. New markets, more capital, a permanent endowment structure so it can't be threatened by company politics again." She looked out at the pasture. "I've been drafting a proposal." "Okay." "It would require significant capital commitment, more than the company's current allocation." "I'd imagine." "The board will push back." "You'll handle them." She looked at him. "You say that very easily, because it's true." He drank his coffee. "You've been handling them for years. This one's worth it, so you'll find the arguments." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to put a structural protection in the endowment," she said. "A named governance seat. Permanent, non-removable by company action." She paused. "I want to name it after my grandfather." Ryan looked at her. She was looking at the cedar trees with an expression that was steady and complicated, and was the kind of expression you wore when you were doing something that connected a wound to something hopeful. "He'd have liked that," Ryan said. "He would have loved this ranch," she said quietly. "He would have found exactly the right chair on this porch, and he wouldn't have moved from it for 3 days. He sounds like a reasonable person." He was. She looked down at the mug. "I miss him." "I know." She leaned her head back against the chair. The morning light came across the porch in the long, slow way of October light, and Diesel had settled between them and was already half asleep, and somewhere down the fence line, one of the mares was moving in the early quiet. Nothing about the moment was large or significant in any external sense. It was just 2 people on a porch in the morning, and one of them had stopped performing, and the other had never started. And the thing between them was not the arrangement they'd signed, and it was not the crisis they'd survived, and it was not the public narrative that had tried to define them from the beginning. It was just this: morning light, cold coffee, a dog between 2 chairs, the particular piece of a place that belonged to both of them, not on any document, but in the way that things come to belong to people who choose them repeatedly, every day, until the choice becomes simply what they are. Ryan thought about the question Victoria had asked him on the first morning he'd given her his answer. Why? And the answer he'd given, which was true as far as it went. He thought about the fuller version, which he understood better now, and which was this: that the people worth showing up for were rarely the ones in perfect circumstances. They were the ones who came to your gate carrying more than they could hold and were too proud to put it down. And sometimes what they needed most was just someone who would stand beside them without requiring them to be anything other than what they actually were. He had not expected to find that so entirely reciprocal. He had not expected a lot of things. He'd expected 40 acres and a horse with bad manners and a 7-year-old who had opinions about birdhouse engineering, and all of that was still true. And now there was also this woman in his chair who was planning a permanent endowment for 60,000 women and missing her grandfather in the October light, and he found that his life had not been diminished by the addition. It had become, in some way that surprised him still, more fully what it had always been trying to be. "Your coffee's going cold," he said. "I know." She didn't move. "You want me to get you a fresh one?" She looked at him sideways, the half-smile that was becoming the most familiar expression in his world. "Are you going inside anyway?" "No." "Then no." She turned back to the pasture. "I'll drink the cold one." He nodded. They sat. Inside, Noah was still asleep, and would be for another 45 minutes. And then there would be the noise and motion of a morning that required things from both of them, breakfast and the bus and the small negotiations of a day beginning. There would be a board call for Victoria at 9 and a delivery from the feed supplier at 10, and Dale coming by at noon with a question about the co-op schedule. The world would continue to require things of them, and they would continue to be imperfect in the specific ways they were imperfect, and they would continue to do it anyway. But for now it was just the morning, just the porch, just the 2 of them with cold coffee and a sleeping dog, and the gold October light moving slow across everything they'd built. Not from a contract, but from the daily, imperfect, entirely genuine choice to keep showing up. That was it. That was all of it. That was enough.